We begin with breaking news at 10 o'clock. We just heard from President Trump saying the U.S. will run Venezuela after capturing Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro.
The U.S. carried out an overnight operation to capture Maduro and his wife, who are now being brought back to the United States to face narco-terrorism charges. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this very active Saturday morning. You're watching the KTLA Morning News at 10 a.m. I'm Megan Tellis.
And I'm Lauren Lister. We thank you so much for joining us. So many questions do remain after that overnight operation as reactions pour in.
So let's bring in an expert. Joining us now is Representative Brad Sherman to share his thoughts on this developing story. Good morning to you, Congressman. Can we get your initial reaction to the news today and the justification that you've at least heard?
Well, there are really two operations. The first was described as a law enforcement operation and was remarkably successful. And we've been remarkably successful at going after particular bad guys, whether that be Osama bin Laden, whether that be a host of others. But the president also announced a second and far more dangerous operation, and that is the invasion and occupation and rebuilding of Venezuela. And that is something that we're not particularly good at and could involve very substantial American casualties. The president used an excuse for not briefing even the leaders of Congress on the first operation. He said, well, Congress leaks. But he hasn't given any excuse for not consulting and involving Congress in the second operation, the upcoming invasion and occupation of Venezuela. He can't say Congress leaks because he announced it on television half an hour ago.
As you said, President Trump says the U.S. will run Venezuela until a judicious transfer of power. You mentioned your concerns about all of that. You're a Democrat. You're a consistent critic of President Trump. How are you and your colleagues planning to react?
Well, we got a briefing on Venezuela on December 15th that was classified, and I can't reveal the classified information. But I made it plain to Rubio and others who were there, everybody was there except the president, that they have got to abide by the War Powers Act. And Rubio pointed out that there are those constitutional scholars who say, well, the War Powers Act isn't binding on presidents. And I reminded him that I got passed an amendment that constitutional scholars say is binding. And it says that no money can be spent in contravention of the War Powers Act. So a quick 1, 2, 3 hour operation in Venezuela, Congress doesn't need to approve that in advance, although they should have notified top leaders. But an invasion and occupation of Venezuela, if it's a hostile situation, that is something Congress needs to be involved in. And we don't know whether the paramilitaries and the military of Venezuela are going to retreat to the hills and wage a guerrilla war, or whether all elements of Venezuela are going to welcome us with open arms. But if you're putting the American military, boots on the ground, by the thousands, to occupy a country in hostilities, you had better involve Congress, and I'm not so sure it's a good idea.
You mentioned Secretary of State Marco Rubio and what he had to say in that press conference. Let's hear from him directly, and then we'll get your reaction.
I want to be clear about one thing. Nicolás Maduro had multiple opportunities to avoid this. He was provided multiple very, very, very generous offers and chose instead to act like a wild man, chose instead to play around.
Chose instead to play around. I know he went on to explain that Maduro was provided generous offers to avoid this capture. And then President Trump said later in the press conference that he even asked Maduro to surrender, and that didn't happen. Why did they capture him? He says because he's flooded our country with criminals. They've stolen oil. He's held Americans hostage. What is your hot take on what Rubio had to say?
Well, it's very hard to give Trump and his administration any credibility when it comes to going after drug kingpins, because although they risked American lives to capture Maduro, they released from jail and pardoned Juan Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was responsible for 400 tons of cocaine entering the United States. Now, Maduro might be a drug kingpin. We don't know. We'll wait for the trial. Hernandez, who Trump freed and pardoned, who was sentenced to over 40 years in prison, he was tried in an American court, and it was established beyond a reasonable doubt that he was responsible for hundreds of tons of cocaine coming into the United States. So it's hard to see this as anything other than Trump sees oil, thinks it's valuable, wants to grab it. And that's not the way to conduct foreign policy. We should care about the drugs that came in from Venezuela, but we shouldn't be pardoning and should not have pardoned the big drug kingpin from Honduras.
Before we go, I do want to ask, you said that if there is an invasion, an occupation, significant boots on the ground in Venezuela, you will very much expect the president to get some kind of congressional approval. But just now, as we stand, what are the next steps for you and your colleagues in Congress?
We should reconvene tomorrow. I doubt the speaker will do that. We are led by a Republican speaker who has tried to completely defang Congress, to turn it into a complete lapdog. And simply, his idea of Congress is that we're just the cheerleaders for the Trump administration. So we will reconvene no later than Tuesday, and we have got to make it plain that an invasion of a hostile, we don't know what the conditions are on the ground in Venezuela, but if we're going to face paramilitaries and a military that is hostile, if we're going to face guerrilla forces, that should not happen without a congressional approval. And based on the very limited information that Trump has provided, I doubt he'd get that approval.
All right. Thank you so much for your take, Congressman Brad Sherman. We do appreciate, again, your time on this Saturday morning.
So we've heard from